Hello. Hello. Just to confuse everyone, welcome to NetMod. We're not DetNetting anymore. We're NetModding. So this is our second session. Somehow I can change slides. Apparently not. All right, so we have our usual note well. I think folks are familiar with it at this point of this time of the week, but as always, it basically says what we say in this room becomes part of our record. If you're not familiar with the note well, please go to one of these URLs. On the administrative side, we are doing our usual audio and video. Please make sure to say your name at the mic. We do have blue sheets that my co-chair will hand off that are going around. Please sign up. We will be doing our usual note-taking on Etherpad. Please look at the link here and jump on it and help us take notes. It's also available from the tools page if you find that easier to get on. I will be on Jabber, and I see that we have folks who are in the room also on Jabber. If you hear a little sound go off, it means someone on Jabber, not me texting. So we're on our second session, and we've arranged our agenda to allow some good time for discussion on three different topics, three different working group topics. First one is tags, which has gone through working group last call and had last call comments, and we'll be going through those. And we have Yang versioning requirements we discussed at the last meeting, and is the product of our design team. We're hoping, just as a heads up, we're hoping that at the end of that, we'll have sufficient support and be at a sufficient state that we're going to move towards adoption. Of course, not everyone's in the room, and we'll confirm anything we do here on the list. And then we'll go through solutions that the design team has been going through. And if we have time, we'll hit one presentation and hopefully hear just about the differences from the last time. We have extra slides that are some backup that we will not go through right now. And with that, Chris.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Christian Hops, and as Lou said, the module tags draft went into working group last call, and we got some lively comments. I'll go over the changes, pretty much adopted, kind of, so pretty much adopted, I say adopted all suggestions. It was actually one that came after that we didn't adopt. And the changes were to add an extension statement for predefined tags so that it would be machine parsable. That was the one that I think garnered the most sort of contention, because I pushed back on that. I didn't think there was a need, but it doesn't really hurt to have it. We changed the tag values used to be strings only, and that was seen as being maybe a little too loose. So we constrained that a little bit. Clarified the structure of our tag, pretty much saying that it's a prefix only, there's no extra structure. The fact that the prefix had a colon in it seemed to make people think that there needed to be colons throughout it, like there was extra hierarchy, and so we clarified that. And then Martin and Jürgen both made suggestions on how to change the tree structure to be more sort of standard in how we do things. And there was some language that got cleaned up. So the extension statement, before I put that it should just be in the description, because my thinking was the predefined tags would be added by the author, the implementers. So they had to write code anyway, so they would be reading the module. It wasn't actually something that would be machine parsed, but you know, machine parsed is better than random text, I guess. So, and it doesn't hurt. It doesn't actually make it harder to implement this, to have this extension. So instead of putting in the description, you know, add these tags when you implement it, you would use this extension module tag statement.
Kent as a contributor. For this one, would it make sense to name it something different, like maybe recommended module tag? Just if you call it module tag, then it looks like it's actually the tag itself that you're expecting it to be for the module, as opposed to being a recommendation.
Okay. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure I parsed that, but maybe we can talk about that on the list, or do you want to talk about it
He
now?
doesn't like the name, that's all. So name it should, and now do I have should, must, may?
Recommended.
It says, yeah, so, or add, or predefined, I don't know. I'm not hip on this thing anyway.
Predefined
so
sounds pretty good.
pick a name and I'll
Chris?
put it. Yeah.
I think predefined sounds like a good suggestion.
Okay.
Does that work, Ken?
Right, so the string, so we restricted the string to basically, and this also defines the minimal structure, which is, you know, your typical identifier type text, which is A through Z, 0 through 9, a dash and an underscore in the second letter, and up to a colon, which is your prefix, and then anything including a space, but not tabs, new lines, no form feeds, and no carriage returns. Hopefully that's what that pattern says. And also the length, saying it was 1 to max. So the structure changes. This is basically just, I guess, best practices. Martin likes a container, so before it was just the list, so you would just have module tags, module tags, module tags in your XML. If it was XML, now it'll be module tags, and inside that module, module, module. So the other comments that were on the working group last call, there was a request for a non-MDA appendix version. I disagreed with this, and also somebody else did. Didn't really get any other comments. My thinking was, not only is this is brand new work, it won't be deployed for a little while. And also, from an operator standpoint, I don't want to make it really easy for people not to implement NMDA. So this, you know, if you're going to do this, you're going to have to do NMDA. If you want to support that, it'll work without it. It just won't work as well. And there was a email exchange on just, you know, clarifying, justifying the use. So that's pretty much it. I think that covers all the comments that we got. And like I said, this was a new version that was pushed out during working group last call. Are there any other issues? I think we're going to just continue the work, keep the working group last call, maybe send an email saying we're keeping it open for another 2 weeks or something.
Question. Who read this during working group last call? Ewell or before? I mean, that was version 02. So I think we have a pretty good sense of a pretty good population in the room of people who had the opportunity to comment on it during last call or thereabouts and are actually reasonably familiar with it. So are there any changes to the, are there any concerns with changes that were made in response to the last call criticism or in version 3 in the room? I think the answer to that is no, which is something we should confirm on the list. But but I don't see a reason why we would pursue a second last call to move ahead. Thank you.
Sorry. So just one comment. Can we add an example?
Oh, right. Kent wants me to, okay, so I was like, do we really need to add an example? But yes, Kent wants one. Can I add, like, can it be binary encoded GPRC? Serious. What
No.
format would you like it?
XML's great.
XML is very netconf centric though, right? This is a Yang model.
JSON's fine.
All right. Anyway, so we're going to add
Just
an
identify
example.
which kind of example it is. Thanks.
Apparently this doesn't work.
That's the clicker.
I don't know.
The new wireless. Thanks.
Uh-oh. Don't touch it. You look good. Yeah.
Okay. And now for something everybody loves. Thank you, Kailash. The product of, so last time Rob Wilton presented the requirements for our Yang versioning design team. This is the update to that, which I anticipate will have absolutely no one saying anything. As we work, we've met numerous times as a design team, both physically here at IETF 103, we met at IETF 102. We had external conversations with stakeholders, and we met many times on the call. This is the design team you can see here. Changes since version 00. We added some terminology specifically around what we mean when we say non-backwards compatible, and I'll get to that. We added some clarification on what clients should do if they get instance data from a server that they do not understand. So for example, 7950, section 11, really talks about what to do if a client tries to do an edit config or change something, and the modules that they're changing should be backward compatible. But what if, for example, you have a CPU, something that represents a CPU, and initially you do a range of 1 to 100, and you realize, a CPU can be 0%, so you add 0, and now an old client reads 0 if it does a get. So we're saying, we just added some clarification to say a client should be able to handle that. I'm not going to go into any more detail on that one. We reworded requirement 1.2, and I'll get to that. And we added a new requirement 1.4, and I'll get to that. And there's lately been some discussion around requirements 3.1 and 3.2, and I'll talk about that. So these are the requirements. Terminology-wise, we define non-backwards compatible in accordance with RFC 7950 section 11, but we also add that with respect to this document and our requirements, non-backwards compatible takes into account the status. So the status means that any addition or change of a status that would allow a server to remove support, for example, going to obsolete, results in a non-backward compatible change. So that was an addition of terminology. Some additional terminology that we've used kind of interchangeably in email and discussions. The NBC part is actually parenthetical in the draft. We say BC to mean a backwards compatible change. NBC is non-backwards compatible change. When Rob gets up here to talk about solutions, so hold all your questions for him, he will talk about the head of a branch, or a Yang module at the head. And in that regard, it means the most current in development history, as you would think of a revision control system being the head or the master, the head or tip of the branch. That's terminology. Requirement 1.2, we wanted to simplify the text so that the new text in requirement 1.2 says that any non-backwards compatible updates of a module, so let's say I change one node, a leaf, in a non-backwards compatible way, but I don't touch any other leafs within the module, that must not impact clients that access only modules that have not been updated or have been updated in backwards compatible ways. The leafs that have been updated in backwards compatible or leafs that have not been updated within that module. So we just wanted to, based on feedback that we got in 102, we wanted to clarify that requirement. We added a new requirement. I'm going to put this down for a second. I anticipate I might be here for a minute on this slide. The design team discussed that there is going to be, despite we don't necessarily want to do this, but this is going to happen. We are going to have the instance where we have a module at an older version, let's say 1.x. We've since made some changes. We've created a branch, a 2.x version of that module. We're making changes to 2.x, and we have to go back and we have to make a fix. We have to do some kind of change to 1.x. Vendors do this today. And in fact, on the design team, Sue Harris mentioned that this is something that could potentially happen within the standards body in some IDR work, where we have two kind of parallel streams of modules. And we wanted a requirement that says the solution that we're coming up with must allow for Yang modules to be versioned in accordance to or respective to software releases. It's not to say that we want to do this. We just recognize that this is a thing and we want to have a solution that accounts for it.
So Rob Shakir from Google. Why is this requirement phrased in terms of a single module needs to deal with this case, right? Because you're basically saying, I must be able to fork any point in the branch and arbitrarily cherry pick from any point in time, and I want a single versioning scheme that deals with that. But we have augment and deviation statements. I think Christian actually made this point elsewhere, right? So the union of in any server is going to have the set of modules that it supports, and it's really, there's some versioning that's based on the union of them all. So you can fix a number of these things. So like, I want to enhance version 1.0 and we're at version 42.0, I can add some new augmentation that adds in features without changing the version of 1.0, right? So I think you've kind of made this problem statement very, very specific of, I want to be able to version exactly how I version my software release as a vendor, not in a useful way for operators. I think Christian made an eloquent argument on the list about this.
We recognize, though, that, so the example you gave just now, we recognize that there could be the need to do, our customers are going to want us to do potentially a bug fix that is non-backwards compatible.
You can do a non-backwards or a backwards compatible bug fix with an augment or a deviation. Not every single one, right? But you can deviate out an entire leaf and add a new one, right?
Well,
so you can mark not supported and add an additional leaf.
So we talked about deviations and if feature. Again, this is the requirement. There could be a number of solutions that address this. We want to be able to have the capability, the requirement to be able to fix these things, to make these bug fixes in non-latest releases and allow for the solution to accommodate that.
Rob Wilton, Cisco. To speak to Rob Shakir's point, I think that if you use either a deviation or an augmentation, you lose the sort of continuity of that fix. So you can't, unless you're going to carry that augmentation through all time, which you don't necessarily want to do, or if you use a deviation, then I think you end up with losing. It becomes harder for a client just to see what's changed in the history of the module. You're now saying you don't just have to use the semantic version, you have to also know all the other modules that might be affecting it. So that's
But we have that problem anyway, right? You can't use an individual module by itself. So when we started the catalog work, we specifically said this is why we have the idea of release bundles, right? We have a bundle of modules that need to work together. So we already have a multiple version problem, like a multiple module version and a release set together. So it doesn't really make any difference if there's another module in there to fix this problem. And I think I did rather mix this problem statement I have with this statement, which is why is it this within a single module with a potential solution? That I think that the requirement here is you want to be able to change an older version, right? In some particular way. I understand that you've shipped some version. Not having it, the way you characterize it based on software release, etc. I think we're just creating huge complexity here.
So yes, the term, the wording of this the spirit of this wording is there are multiple trains, streams, releases of software, and our customers, and this was expressed in the design team, have a need to have fixes to releases that aren't the latest. This is where this requirement came from. And we found that there might be needs within standards bodies to do the same thing. How do we address that?
Right, but then this requirement should state that you have a requirement to be able to make fixes backwards compatible or non-backwards compatible in historical versions, and have some way to identify those. Not that it should be versioned by software release.
Okay, I would agree that that the way this is stated is confusing. I agree
Chris,
with that.
so from Jabber, Martin Berkman says +1 to Rob Shakir. I think it was to the earlier part and earlier comment. This was the original idea of how to handle this. So it was just one of the earlier comments.
Okay.
Christian Hops. Yeah, so I actually love the wording because it's exactly what you want, right? And as an operator, it's exactly what I don't want. You know, I don't want your developers off making a change on, XR, I'm sorry to be specific, version X and version Y, right? And these two teams maybe don't work together, right? And so version X developers are over there and they're making some changes and they've got some automated tools and it pushes it in and whiz bang, because I've got versions now, it changes the major because it sees it's incompatible. And Y over here is doing their development separately, and whiz bang, it works because we've got these versions now, right? And as an operator, I'm screwed because now I've got all these different stupid incompatibilities because people couldn't get together, right, and create a single train for the APIs that you're shipping. And the whole point of NetMod, right, was to get away from CLIs and into all these little differences all over the place. I'm sympathetic to the thing of being able to make a non-backwards compatible change, like because I got the range wrong, right? So I was thinking about this today because I keep making the same point and it keeps coming back even harder and harder. If you restricted major version changes to non-structural, I'd be good with it. But I don't think that's what you're doing. I guess the last thing I'll say is I'd like to see some use cases because I keep hearing, I mean, we can all picture the changes you're talking, bug fixes. Oh, my customers, I am your customer, by the way. But your customers want bug fixes. I'm not your only customer, I understand. But your customers want bug fixes, right? But I mean, like Rob was talking about, it's like, I'd like to see some justification for these things that can't be done with the other mechanisms we already have, because it's sort of tenuous. It's like, oh, there's these bug fixes we might want to make. I mean, I know the use case that people want to use this for, and it's not for these bug fixes. It's to be able to just freely release multiple trains of modules. And that the scale there is the vendor is a small number of people, the users is a large number of people. Your impact is very large. Right? So we have to be very careful about who we're making things easy for, right? It would be great if we could make software development easy, but if the cost is we make it really, really hard for tons of people that use it, it's not worth it.
So I would love to address this with some use cases. And in fact, we talked about one. I just feel that if I go down this path, I'm going to be talking about solutions. But I can give you an example that we talked about, specifically about again, the wording aside, we talked about a BGP module, a 1.0 of a BGP module. And we want to introduce this concept, this new backwards compatible concept called BGP groups in 1.1. It's backwards compatible. But, so now we have a 1.1 and we have a 1.0. A customer comes along and says, I found a bug that requires an actual fix to the module, which it might be rare. The module fix might be rare, but let's say they do require a fix to the module in 1.0. Now, if we just say we're going to apply that fit, that we only have the one thing, 1.1, and we're going to apply that fix there with BGP groups, now we've given a module to a customer where that support in the underlying operating system, the underlying product doesn't exist. Now, we can protect that behind if feature. We can deviate. And this is why I'm now getting into the solution, because now I'm getting beyond the requirement. And the solution stuff's debatable, but now we're adding all this extra baggage to these Yang modules as we go, baggage that kind of has to exist for a long time. So Rob will talk about the solutions that we arrived at. And in fact, one of the things you said, Chris, was very pertinent in sorry, Rob, I see you going, I'm going to kill you later on, Joe, and that's fine. I accept death. One of the things that Rob will talk about in his slides is he has that spectrum. Hard for operators, hard for vendors. And we've said explicitly, we want to, ultimately, we're going to walk away compromised so that nobody's happy. It's a compromise. We're going to try to find the happy medium. We feel that the problem space is real, though. And these are the requirements, be it they might need to be wordsmith, but these are the requirements that we as a design team feel that this will achieve if we can satisfy these requirements, and maybe they're trade-offs, we will achieve something that ultimately is a better solution to the problems we're facing.
Okay, but what are you compromising on as a vendor? This gives you everything you want.
This is a requirement. This doesn't mean that there could be a number of ways to solve this, including one that says we say we must, but this could be areas as we implement this, as we discuss the solutions to these requirements, that we have to say, look, we're going to then wrangle, or we're going to fence what types of changes can be made to these other historical streams. We're going to limit branching. And again, we might not see so much of this because it's a module, and maybe there isn't a need to bug. A null pointer exception, null pointer deref is not going to necessarily cause a module to change. So I can still do bug fixes in my code. But we want to allow, vendors are going to do this. We want to allow some kind of fence around this, some sort of quantification of this, and that's why we wrote the requirement. And okay, we'll change the wording, but that's why we built the requirement. Because we want to solve for the vendor problem, we want to solve for the standards problem as best we can.
I feel compelled to chime in. This is Lou, that you also want to solve the user problem. And for some of us, and I'll take off chair hat, that's the #1 problem to solve.
And we want to solve the user problem.
Thanks.
Yeah, Rashad Rahman from Cisco. I actually forgot what I wanted to say. It's been so long waiting here. Actually, I wanted to reply to Chris, who I think you've said on the email to you're worried that this is just going to give vendors a free card to say, I can screw up the users whenever I want to. This is not the goal. If you think there's never a need to do any NBC change, then we're done. But sometimes that change will be needed. This is a way of addressing that. And yes, I think we spoke about guidelines. I don't know if they're documented yet to say that this is not, and as Joe was saying, you don't fix a bug and change the Yang model, just because you're fixing a functionality bug. So.
Rob Wilson, Cisco, I'm basically say the same comment, Chris. This is not our goal to give carte blanche. So we can change this text. The goal is to allow for bug fixes, potentially allow for enhancements, and to have a way of describing what those are. So you could, as a user of those modules, you can understand what the change is happening. So that's our goal.
Rob Shakir, Google again. I think that there's multiple requirements from distilling this conversation that you've said. There's a problem about how do I release my software such that I'm able to understand the set of functionality that's in it and to be able to granularly choose what to uprev and what not to. And then there's the problem of what does the module version itself look like? Perhaps a good thing to do is to explain what the release problem is, because that is kind of the union of modules problem anyway. And then discuss how that's implemented across both servers and tooling. Because if I look at our tool set right now, we do something similar to what I was suggesting, right? So we have a set of changes, we have a bunch of clients that haven't moved, and we maintain these really small compatibility modules. And they're there to say, okay, this deviated out, or this leaf is still here, and then we go and work with all the folks to move, which is equivalent to your customers upgrading. So, and I haven't found that a big problem in terms of management, and it's quite clear to me how I version my set of releases, like my generated code or whatever it is, that's the API that my users are integrating against. So, like, I think we should break it down and figure out what those look like, because I really don't think that this problem space really is it needs its own approach in the version in the module to meet the same requirement. And I just want to say that I think we should make it super hard not to have a single head. Like, I think anything that's encouraging you to have 9 million different branches where you cannot merge them back together, which we see software that does this every day, like, let's stop making crappy decisions about how to forecast software so that we end up with those problems. So I completely agree with Christian's point about that. Make it as hard as possible.
I agree. And this is some of the things that we talked about as coming out of, in fact, some of what you just said around the compatibility shims. In fact, even today, talked about things around that space from a solution standpoint, but from a requirement standpoint, independent of how this is worded, it's not just the vendors. There has been expressed a need to have a non-linear need to update modules, maybe not willy-nilly, but it has been expressed.
So let's write those things down, because as one of the original authors of the BGP model that you've referenced in IDR, and as probably the, I think, only person in this room that's maintaining a semantically versioned set of Yang modules as one of the leads of a project, I'm not sure my experience matches with your impassioned plea for this.
Balázs Lengyel Ericsson. Actually, we are also maintaining Samba modules, but what is strange for me that this is not a vendor requirement. It's the operators that come to us and say, I don't want to upgrade my module, please change the old one.
If an operator's toolchain can't pick up one compatibility module, there is a bigger problem with their compatibility toolchain. And so remember here, you have a conversation with your customers in which you may not be allowed to say no, or encouraged not to say no, or they might have enough dollars that saying no is not a thing. The IETF does not have to operate under those constraints. So you can version your modules, 47 different point releases and use the entire Unicode character set as part of the versioning. Just don't make it my problem, please.
Robert and Cisco. So, but using a compatibility module is just a solution to this requirement, the second part of it. Is it not? How is it different?
Because we are not versioning by software release.
Yeah.
And we're not saying that we go back and change an old module. So the old module keeps its exact same version, and then the union set of modules lets you link them together. And that's exactly what you can do in your code with having semantic versioning for Yang modules. So if you want to talk about how to do release bundle versioning, that's maybe a different problem. But I think that you can use semantic version for both release bundles and for individual modules and work just fine.
So I think it's more, Rob Wilton, I think it's more that are you suggesting that the modules will do deviations to fix it or augmentations? But I don't think, so I think that's a solution to this. Ignore the first line and consider the second line. That's a way of handling, I need to do bug fixes and enhancements to older modules.
The language already has. So the problem here is that this is meant to be a requirement about how to put a version in a Yang module, right? But there's been other work to try and address this. Like we put the catalog draft into the working group, like, I don't know, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, someone can check the date. But so I don't understand why this is a requirement that relates at all to the version I put in a Yang module. And when we originally raised the versioning problem, remember the only thing we had was a date. So like, I think you're kind of going down let's try and solve a huge set of problems that need to be solved in multiple layers based on just like, let's get better than the date in the module.
Yeah, it's like the big, huge problem, right, is being able to import by revision, and that was it, I think. And everything else is sort of like solving many, many more problems. Like, oh, let's open this whole thing up. And yeah.
Again,
So
these-
at some point, I think it would be good to get a definition of a bug fix.
So Lou's well, you heard it. We tried that to get a definition of a bug fix, and we found that that was in and of itself, if you didn't like the word software release, you certainly weren't going to like that conversation, because some individual's bug fix was some other person's feature. We found that very hard. What we wanted to be able to do with this requirement, independent of the first line, was really about, as we discussed this on the design team, amongst all of us, we kept circling, going back and forth, because we had a need based on what our customers came to us as. So what Chris just said, there were some big, like, kind of low-hanging fruit, and I think Rob Shakir said it as well, low-hanging fruit with things we had to fix. And then we started to talk, well, how do we address this, and how do we address that, and how do we kind of build something that gives the user a little bit more definition to what vendors are going to do anyway. And that's where we arrived at specifically at this requirement.
What vendors are going to do anyway should not be endorsed by the IETF, right? Like, please separate the how do we solve this problem correctly from how shitty is this release going to be? Because this is like, the problem is, if I look at your versioning, if I look at my versioning, they're going to be entirely different. And so as soon as we try and have this problem space of trying to link these behaviors within a certain release train into something wider that's in the module, then we're both going to disagree. And to the point about a bug fix, I mean, we tried to write a doc. There's a doc on openconfig.net that describes the semantic versioning approach we use and lists a set of criteria for what do we consider as a backwards incompatible change. We have a set of things that say this is, I think we don't use the word bug fix. We use something like a non-feature patch. Sure, there's some wordsmithing to be done in similar, but I don't understand why this problem is apparently so difficult when I don't remember I think it took us a bunch of debate, but not as many meetings as you suggested were required to get to this point.
That's fair. We had a lot of different perspectives. And there's even more.
Perhaps it would be good to document what you agree on and what you disagree on, and that would help us under the requirements, and then we as a group could decide which of those things we want to include and which we don't.
Okay. Sure. Yes. Slide 2, please. Actually, this is, I think, the second to last, penultimate. I wasn't even going to put this on here because these didn't change. These were discussed as they are written last time. However, Andy brought up recently on the list, what do these requirements mean? And again, these are the requirements, not to speak of any particular solution. 3.1 says that the solution, whatever that is agreed upon, must provide a mechanism to allow servers to support existing clients in a backwards compatible way, which is kind of what we have today. 3.2 is, I think, where we have a little bit more contention. It says the solution must provide a mechanism to allow servers to simultaneously support clients using different versions of modules. I'm going to stop there because according to the rules of Yang, a server supports one revision of a module. That was brought up. However, today, if you take that, and again, this is a requirement, so I'm not going to necessarily dive into the solution, but if you take that today and say, okay, well, today, if I want to make a non-backwards compatible change to a module, let's say I want to redefine a leaf, and I don't want to change the name of the leaf. So you know what? I'm going to create a new module. I'm going to create a module used to be called foo. I'm going to call it bar now. But you know what? I didn't like foo. I'm just going to not include it in the next release. I'm just going to have bar. The client is still inconvenienced because the client says, well, there's no foo there. I don't know how to go to bar. There's no implicit relationship between those modules. So the status quo kind of provides a mechanism for this because it doesn't, and you could say, oh, I can just create another module. What we're trying to do with 3.2 is come up with a better way to link, to tell the client that this module has moved ahead. But then we thought, well, what about the old clients? What about a client that comes along and it doesn't know about this new module or about the changes? How can we provide that support? Okay, one of the solutions we talked about, just to give an example context, was that there would be a way of the client signaling as maybe part of the hello negotiation that this is the module set or the module context or the set of modules that I want to use. And there would be various versions of those modules. I think it kind of like what Rob, a package of module. This is within this context, I want to use this. And so the old client can kind of tell the server, this is what I use. There's a lot of complexity with that though. There's a lot of complexity with a server needing to support that. And part of Andy's comments was, well, right now there is no concept of that. The server supports one revision. So this is something that needs to be discussed more. The requirement was put there because there were again individuals who said, I want to be able to, as best as possible, as seamlessly as possible, support those older clients. Just a requirement at this point, but that's something that we wanted to have there, and that's why it exists in the requirements draft.
So Rob Shakir again. Actually, I think there's a need to support this kind of module filtering anyway, right? So if you look at most servers, the reality is even if they support one version of the module, they support multiple modules that export the same data, right? So
yes.
Like I go and do a get on Slash. I get back the entire contents of your native modules as well as whatever third-party modules you support. So we added in GNMI specifically to handle this, a way that you have a kind of mask on the module set that you can say, okay, here's the set of modules that I want to use. Actually, in that, they do include the version. So by accident, I think we support this kind of approach. I don't know that we have ever thought about implementing filtering solely on the module rendering. But I think that there's a good reason to have this. And this, I think it's questionable whether it's actually reality that you will just support one module. It's a kind of challenge if you have linking in, it requires some coordination at software upgrade time to mutate the stored running configuration, which is kind of interesting.
And those are some of the things we talked about, exactly that, including some of the mapping issues you alluded to. Chris?
Yeah, did you not, so that sounds like a great idea actually, right?
You might just your name again.
Oh, Christian Hops. So, like if we go back to the old Unix days, right? IO kettles, you have like an ABI concept, right? And it embedded the version number in the syscall, right? So, or in the IO kettle. And so the kernel could actually implement backwards compatible, incompatible, it could do the translation because it knew what you were coded to, right? And so you could do that if the client, because the client knows what, if I write some software in the client, I know what modules and what versions I wrote them to. It's not hard for me to include that. And then if I signal that to the server can actually deal with having incompatible changes. It can map them for me. I mean, so you decided against that though?
No. You have just agreed that this is a requirement. You and Rob have both, in fact, Rob even said it's implemented. I'm done. No, you just agreed that it's a requirement. Again, this is the requirements draft, and we wanted to put forth that we think this is a requirement. And there could be multiple ways of solving it, as you and Rob have pointed out. So we wanted to address the comments that were on list, that why is this a requirement? There is some difficulty, there's some challenges on the server side in doing this, but it could be something that a solution needs to address. Next. Okay. No one thought it was possible, but here we are. So we think up until 10 minutes ago that the requirements were complete with respect to what the work group had said. Clearly, there is some work still to be done. The wording of 1.4 in particular, and Lou, you brought up, maybe we need to be a little bit more specific about what we've discussed and agreed to. I think from a requirement standpoint, though, the design team is on the same page. Solutions, it might be a little bit different because there are a number of solutions, but from a requirement standpoint, independent of wording, irrespective of the wording, which we agree needs to be fixed, we feel that we are aligned.
For the room, I want to confirm what I think I've heard the changes that were requested. One is to strike that first part of 1.4 that says software, and for the second part, enumerate what bug fixes mean. And it's perfectly okay to say we agree on this part and we disagree on this part. And so it's not a formal definition; it's a step towards that definition.
Okay.
Do people agree with that? Any disagreement? No. Does it work for the authors?
The first part absolutely works for me. I just know that there was some, if we don't have to come with a formal definition of bug fix and we're allowed to dissent, I think that would work. I think Rob will probably comment as well, but yeah, in general, I think so.
Christian helps. I don't like 1.4. I mean, I don't know how many different ways I can say that. So I don't like it. I'm willing to just be a dissenter. That's fine. But yeah, I mean, changing the words, unless you want to just put not in front of it, it's not a requirement. That's the wordsmithing.
Maybe perhaps when you do the next update, mark that as still under discussion.
So Robert and Sister, so Chris, the second sentence on that about bug fixes, enhancements, are you opposed to that as well?
Mike, please.
That's what I was saying. If you want to say that the major version only changes with non-structural changes, then yeah, I mean, if you're willing to go that far, yeah.
Chris, Chris, that might happen when we enumerate what a bug fix is. You may look at that list and you say, yeah, I can live with that.
Okay.
I mean, that's part of the reason. That's part of the reason to call it out is we know what it means.
Okay. If we don't define it in the requirement and we're just saying, well, leave that to the implementation, I don't know why we have the requirement. Because doesn't the requirement drive the implementation?
Right now, I don't understand what the requirement says right now. So, once it's enumerated, maybe we can understand what it means.
Rob Shakir, I think we should remove this entire requirement. I don't agree with the second sentence either. I think that the assumption here is that this assumption that everything has to be done in a single module is sufficiently controversial that removing this requirement and working out what the actual requirement is probably the right thing.
huh.
Well,
And I say because of all the conversations we've had. I would like to hear, I would honestly like to hear you come to the design team meeting and express some of this, have this in a little bit more of a back and forth conversation. Not to
happy
say
to
that
have
you're
a-
not discussing it, but with the team as a whole.
Well, I think you can look through our, like, the changes in versions in OpenConfig are a matter for the Git history, right? So you can look at what the changes that we've made across now a few years of developing modules look like for the different types of things that we will have had to patch, right? So I'm happy to point that out and point out what we've had to, what changes we've had to make. No, thank you to the design team. I've spent many words in NetMod conversations.
Sure, all data is good data. It's something to read and understand. We have put forth, and I say we, the design team has put forth examples, and I agree that maybe we should quantify bug fix a little bit, but put forth examples where there is a compelling need to fix things without introducing additional, like, if feature or deviations. It was actually raised.
Rob Shakir again. The cost you're avoiding is a cost that the operator side already has to deal with, right? Because any module that's out there, you've given me a set of augmentations for, oh, I support, whiz-bang knob A, which isn't in the module, or a set of deviations that, oh, we don't support this thing that's in your standard model. So I've already had to deal with this kind of problem of I have a vendor device and I have a set of modules that have to work together, simply by virtue of the fact that there is this organizational split between the module developers. So what I'm saying is, you would like to push one Yang module. I already had to deal with the fact that there are N Yang modules. So, like, you're optimizing to solve a problem that actually the only advantage of is to you, and the complexity of me understanding now what the server is doing has gone up.
So actually, I am hearing some. Can I just one more before you give me the hook? As a requirement, you can say this is a problem we have recognized in the vendor space. It's a problem. What you just said there could be a solution to that problem. I think, though, acknowledging that the problem exists as a requirement is important still.
But this is coming back to the point I made earlier about, this is more about release versioning of sets of modules than it is an individual module. And those are separate problems that we should address in ways that are general, not trying to shoehorn into the version that's in the module some crazy level of complexity of your release cycle, because it's negatively impacted everyone that's dealing with this version.
Kent as chair. So I do think we're talking about a solution right now. Going back to, I think Rob said that he wanted to strike the entire requirement, and actually he said the same thing before when this slide was on the screen. And he actually had different, he expressed it, I'm sure it's in the recording or we'll have it in the minutes, how the requirement could be re-expressed that would be suitable to him. So I think that was the point that he was trying to make about striking the entire requirements, rewrite it in a different way. So it didn't suggest a solution. And
that's, yes, I agree with rewriting it. And that's, yes, I would, peace.
Michael Abrams. So Rob just said what I was going up to here to say, but I just want to say it more clearly. If there is 1,000 customers using this model, now 1,000 customers have to change stuff in their NMS with this incompatible change. So you got less work, but 1,000 people got more work because they had to do stuff in their NMS to support the incompatible change. That is the point you're making, right, Rob?
I actually don't think it's that's related to this requirement. I think the backwards incompatible or non-backwards compatible change is just in general.
I think it's a mixture of the two, right? The point I was making, that there's a challenge with the backwards incompatible, like making any backwards incompatible change. Of course, that means that you have to. There's some requirement to be able to for people to consume that. Now, this is kind of more an argument of should you support more than one version, or do you have to support more than one version of the same module? Because then at that point, you presumably there's one of your customers that wants this thing and 999 who don't. I think that's a slightly orthogonal point to the one I was making, which was already when you get a vendor release, they then don't support all of the modules. So you have to support this combination of modules working together, and you have to support deviating or augmenting and how to consume that and how to manage the fact that now you have N vendors who have all got a different set of augmentations and deviations. What I was saying is this requirement and this being lumped in with module versioning ignores the fact that you've already had to deal with all of that as an operator, and the rather gives it introduces a new thing in the version to be able to deal with that. And what I'm saying is, I don't see any case that I've had to deal with that wouldn't be met by an alternate solution, which can be entirely outside of this problem space.
Tim Carey, Nokia. So, somewhat agree with Rob. So, are we dealing with versioning as it relates to the module, or the versioning in the context of a module, right? Or are we dealing with versioning of what comprises a solution, which is a software release, right? And so, this has gone beyond just a module, right? To the larger system requirement, right?
No. Put frankly, this is poorly written, and if anyone ever invents a time machine, I'm going to go back and strike that first sentence so it's never presented. The part of what we discussed in the solutions, which you may hear next, did talk about that kind of composite of multiple modules and how one might, again, solutions that could be multifaceted, how one might address that composite of modules. The requirements in this draft are specifically around versioning a module, or how do we indicate non-backwards compatible changes within a module.
Okay, so why would you ever then, because that's not true, because you've just said it, the solution must allow for, and I'm going to say a module, right, to be versioned by software release. You've just taken it from being a versioning of a module to a versioning of a context.
We did not mean that. We really meant the second sentence, and we're going to strike that and retool this.
All right,
yes.
So maybe when I see it when it's retooled, but I have a lot of empathy towards what Rob is saying. We're dealing with versioning of modules, not solutions.
So, Rob Shakir, can I just encourage, we published in October 2015 a catalog and registry for Yang modules draft that has a section that covers specifically versioning of things together and bundling of separate modules. I would, not because it's an excellent read and going to enthrall you, just for background of where the point comes from and the wider problem space, we tried to describe it there.
So Rob Wilton, Cisco, to me, this requirement is saying to the operators is if we've shipped a release and it's using a particular module and you're using that, and you discover a bug, you find it can't take a particular IP address because there's a mistake in that. Is it acceptable for us to say, I'm sorry, we cannot fix this for you? To get the fix, you have to upgrade to the latest release of this module, which means you have to upgrade to the latest release of this software and buy new hardware.
But that's not what we're saying, Rob Shakir, frustratedly in brackets. We're not saying that that there must be you must go to the tip of head every time, right? Because there are already ways to deal with those cases. So this compatibility module already deals with it. But that's not what this problem is saying, right? This is about module versioning, and it's saying that the module versioning should support something that's a cross-module problem.
What we are saying, what,
Rob, it says the solution.
yeah,
It doesn't say how the solution.
But
addresses
why
it.
is this a model versioning problem? That's my problem, right?
It's the whole topic. It's the whole topic, and so it's going to cover the whole topic.
So I think we actually have sort of solidly established what everyone thinks at this point. What we don't have is a solution that gets us out of this room, like with this solved right now. So
there's a hallway right there. I'm thinking. of jumping
I
into.
was thinking of pulling the fire alarm, but that seems a little irresponsible. So
Okay, back to the last slide. I'm going to finish like in a minute here. I promise. It sounds like we will resolve ongoing discussion items. We have a list of items to resolve. I'm guessing that asking for adoption of the requirement space is not yet viable.
What we'd like to do is to see an updated version with your best update to 1.4. You can mark it, and you should mark 1.4 is still under discussion, and we will then poll the working group and see where we are. And it may be that part of that poll is vehement objection to one part of the text, or it may be that we fail to adopt it that way.
Who objects to adopting this?
What's that?
Does anybody object to adopting this?
That's our point.
Yeah, I don't think anybody objects. We do want to fix like import by revision, or, I mean, like you said, the low hanging fruit. So we can keep working.
So that's what we just talked about in the working group. Is it sufficient where it's at to adopt and fix these problems? Does the working group object to the problem space and the requirements? And
I think with that one change, do your best update to 1.4, mark it as that item is still under discussion, under review, and then we'll poll. Now, with that change, how many think that that would be a suitable foundation, that document would be a suitable foundation for identifying the requirements of our solution for SEMVer, or sorry, for versioning. I don't want to use SEMVer. SEMVer is a solution.
So Rob Shakir, I think that the draft should be very clear that it's solving wider than just a module problem space, because I think from either the introduction or the abstract, I would not take that.
That would be a great adoption comment.
I will post it verbatim to the list.
Thank you. So, with subject to the changes we've discussed, who thinks that this document will be a good foundation for our work on versioning? I see lots of hands, so a good number of people.
just going to keep my hand up.
With that, we are actually only 3 minutes behind schedule, which is
Seriously?
amazing. Yes.
I'm sorry, Rob. I really tried to hold it.
By the way, thank you, Joe.
So I don't quite know how. It's not. So, so quick agenda. I'm not quite sure. Are we still on track time-wise? We are. Okay. So, first of all, I'm going to say we'll cover some interesting questions for solutions to consider. Some of those have actually been quite heavily debated already. Then there's the solutions comparison draft considers 5 solutions. I wouldn't say that the design team thinks these are the only solutions possible. They're the ones that we've discussed in most detail. I wouldn't say there's necessarily consensus within the design team on a particular one of these solutions is the best way forward. Although in the discussions we've had this week, the room was converging towards one particular solution as their preferred one at this time. Modified SEMVer is the one that we like at the moment, and hence I'll cover that in a little bit more detail at the end. And then if this time permitting, there's other related issues to versioning that we're also considering, such as data node lifecycle, like proposing change to the status statement, revision dates important by version and compatibility that we'll also discuss at this time. So, next slide. So this is one that Joe already pointed out. It's the same thing, that in terms of solution space, at one end you have stuff that is really easy for clients and hard for servers and authors, i.e. The ideal is to produce perfect models that never change. At the other extreme, you have something that's hard for clients and easy for servers and authors, server implementations, where they can say, we can do whatever we like, and clients just have to suck it up and cope with it. Now, we are not trying to find a solution that is either the end of these extremes. We're trying to find the sort of compromise solution that fits reasonably well between these two. Next slide, please. Already?
Can you pull that slide back? So what's is this weighted? Is this a logarithmic scale? No, because I hope it's logarithmic, right? Because if you're looking for the middle, there's only a few vendors, right? And there's tons of users, right? So you definitely want to push it towards the tons of users. You don't want something in the middle.
There's no scale on it. So, and in terms of this, we were having some of this discussion. There's a question about what level of change in Yang models should we accept, both for new development and in this, what level of change should we accept at the head of development, as in where the tip of the current stuff, what should you allow? Should you allow no changes at all? Should you allow backwards compatible changes only, or should you allow also MVC changes? And then you have that same question can be applied to sort of branched history stuff. So where you've got an older revision of the software, again, should you allow no changes to that? Or should you be allowing some changes, like bug fixes maybe? Should you be allowing non-backwards compatible changes, which might be bug fixes, there might be enhancements. There's questions here as to what should be allowed. Next question, next slide, please. And, sorry, that was for new development. And exactly the same questions apply to bug fixes. So what effectively should you be allowed to do at the head to fix a bug? What should you be allowed to do in an older release on a branch somewhere? Again, what should the solution be allowed to do? And then there's open questions of that, like what is the definition of bug fix? That, as Joe was saying, we discussed this in the design team and we did not come to consensus of what a bug fix is. To give that in a bit more detail, I think a bug fix is, for example, any broken functionality you're trying to make that right. Is my interpretation, whereas Jürgen had a sort of different interpretation that said along the lines of that the description statement describes the intended behavior, and hence you could fix other Yang statements to marry up to the description, but you couldn't change an ambiguous description. So there's differences there in terms of what we thought. There's differences as to whether we thought a bug fix could be non-backwards compatible update or not. And again, there's the sort of questions as to what an MVC update means in terms of Yang. There's our RFC 7950 rules effectively say if you ever change any of these statements, that's guaranteed to be non-backwards compatible. If I change a pattern statement and fix a mistake in that that's obvious, is that an MVC update or not? The Yang 7950 rules say yes, it is. But in some of the discussion, I think what we want to say is we almost don't want that to be, or maybe it shouldn't be if it's obvious. But there's questions here as what to do, and there's questions in terms of the solutions as to how you label those changes. I mean, if it's fixing a pattern statement, do you label that as a non-backwards compatible update and a Semver major update, or do you label it as something else as a bug fix? Because somebody could be broken by it, somebody might not be. Most people won't be. And then one of the discussions we had in the design team is whether we should be even trying to differentiate between bug fix enhancements at all. Is that a fool's errand to actually try and differentiate these two cases? And maybe in terms of the scheme, you don't need to do that. You just have a way of labeling these releases, and you have a way of describing documentation what the best practices are without trying to pin these things down that can be hard to define. Next slide. So, is the clicker working? Oh, it was over there. So, and then the last one that we're considering is in terms of how much branching do you want to allow? How much branching should we allow? On the left-hand side, this side, then we have sort of strictly linear history, and that's what RFC 7950 rules are today. That's what my interpretation of those rules are. Jürgen pointed out that, well, you can create new modules, and in some senses you can create branching with that. I don't know, maybe that's possible. So even there's questions with that. But do you want a linear history where all the updates are always to the head? You never change anything in the past. Or do you want to have the right-hand side where you have this unbounded branching, like in a Git repository or something, where you can create branches and child branches of those and have unbounded complexity there. And then you have somewhere in between of saying, do you allow some sort of limited branching to occur so that you can put bug fixes onto older releases, or some enhancements on older releases when particular customers request them, operators request them. So again, there's questions here as to what is the right choice. Where should we try and place this? So of the 5 solutions that we've looked at, we've discussed a few more and dismissed some more, some of these, but the ones that effectively we've had most discussion on is standard Semver, and this is as defined per semver.org. And I don't know if the open config definition is exactly the same as semver.org, or it's a refinement that maybe Rob can clarify.
It's basically based on that. We have a doc, it's on openconfig.net, that was the specific realization of Semver and openconfig. So like what constitutes each part of the number we published a few years ago.
Okay, thank you. Now I propose a modified version of that we call modified Semver. We had a per release Semver that we discussed. I'll present that. And then there's a sort of schema comparison tool. This is quite a different way of solving the problem and looks quite different, so we'll discuss that. And then finally, we've left in the existing do no changes, we'll keep the RFC 7950 module update rules and what that looks like. So next slide, please.
Question, does your evaluation cover all the requirements that were in the requirements document?
Excellent question. So no, this is just covering a subset of the requirements.
Okay.
So there are some requirements that I cover in those other slides at the end, effectively, and there's some that we haven't even got to yet. Okay. So this is effectively what we felt like was tackling the biggest problem. Maybe not everyone will agree it was the biggest problem, but that's what we feel as a design team is the number one thing to try and get pinned down first, and then try and settle everything else around that.
But we won't have a solution until all requirements are covered, correct?
Yes, quite possibly that's true. We may look at or may request staging the solution drafts so that we have solutions to some of the requirements and then we have separate drafts solving other bits.
Okay.
Because some of them may require language changes and there's a question of do we wait for Yang 2.0, which I'm not keen on.
Sounds dangerous, but we'll see.
Okay. Next slide, please. So Semver, so just to clarify what this is, if anyone doesn't know, Semver has a version number which is major.minor.patch. There's a specification on semver.org. I don't think the specification is actually quite as tight as it should be. There's some ambiguity in terms of what's allowed. And as far as my interpretation of Semver is, it's really talking about the head of the development tree. It's saying that when you're changing at the head, you update the Semver in different ways to indicate what sort of change you've made. If you make a non-backwards compatible change at the head, you increment the major version number and you reset minor and patch back to 0. If you make a backwards compatible change, you increment the minor, you leave major as the same, you increment minor and you reset patch back to 0. And if you make in terms of Semver, it's defined as really as an implementation change. In terms of a Yang model, which I think really defines an API, it's an editorial change, then increment patch. So an example of like a patch change to the Semver or rules I would deem as being, if you fixed a typo in a description statement, then that should be a valid patch increase. I don't think other than that, if you change the meaning of the description statement, that's not a patch. That's a major or minor change. And then there's some other rules that says that you have 0.x.y, that's a pre-release, and you don't have to follow these rules. So you have some level of being able to iterate on the module when it's new before you actually have to fix to these particular rules. The expectation is that the development is broadly linear. Because of the way this number scheme works, you can sometimes put bug fixes in. So in this, on the line on the right of the graph, you can see you have version 1.0.0 and you created 1.1.0. You can create 1.0.1 and 1.0.2. So you can create patch changes because you don't conflict with anything. But you couldn't, if you had 1.0.0 and 1.1.0 already defined, you couldn't do either a major or minor change to 1.0.0. You couldn't put a bug fix in that actually has any change in behavior because you can't give it a useful number.
Okay, so I, why would you fix, I mean, we're talking about schema, right? Modules.
Yeah.
Why would I put a fix on 1.0
Yeah.
and not 1.1?
You wouldn't. You would put it on both of them. So it's quite plausible. So if you have, this is the tree of schemas. You're managing these entirely separately, like OpenConfig maybe, and then you've got various releases that are shipping with some of these modules. And release X is shipping with module 100, and you come up to me and say, you've got a bug in this, I need you to fix it. Or I would
It's
like
a
you to
module,
fix
right?
it.
It's a bug in the module definition.
Yes.
Right? It's not software bug.
Not an
It's
implementation,
a
it's a-
module bug.
Yes.
So why wouldn't I just fix it in the latest version?
Why don't you fix it in 2.01?
No, 1.1.0.
Well, if it was a major change, then you can't. If it's a non-backwards compatible change, you can't fix it in 1.1.0. You have to go to 3.0.0.
Right, but I mean, your example there is shooting off like 1.0.1.
That's because I've got a cosmetic change. You've came to me and say you've got a spelling mistake in this description statement. I can't live with spelling mistake. You've got to fix it. Then I can increment the
Why
change.
wouldn't it be 1.1.1? I don't understand why you're branching there. But
So I think this diagram is a little bit misleading, right? Because essentially, I don't think that there's cases in which you're really going to go back and produce 101 and 102. It's really, it's incrementing in time, and it's like, oh, we published 100 and we like screwed up and didn't run the spell check against it. So we fix it, and then it's just what is head called at this point in time. And then at some point it becomes, oh, this was a feature that we added, so it's 1.1, and now it's a backwards compatible, so it's 2.0. But there's like, I mean, it's not that you go, check out this old revision, make this change, and then like, oh, we'll create a new branch. It's really just what is head called at this time.
And well, maybe. So I think what you described as the Sembo rules is the spirit of it. But you can still go back and you could have that linear line of 100, 110, 200, and go back and decide, actually, I want to put fixes in there. That is possible.
It is possible, yeah.
I
think that see,
Well,
there's kind of
okay.
a question here about software development practice
Yeah,
that you want to follow versus software development practice that an arbitrary versioning scheme can be. Because otherwise we could just version based on the SHA in Git, and we're going to be super happy.
Okay. So to go back to Chris's point is, yes, as a vendor, we could say we won't put your minor bug fix into 100. We'll only do it on 120, for example. That's where you could put it in here. And then you'll say, okay, but I want to have that fix in the software you ship to me. And it's like, well, we can't give that to you because it means we need to backport the feature that is in 110 to that release, and we won't do that. It's too expensive to do.
and is that, I mean, this is a valid question, I think. Is that something we want to solve at IETF? How you ship software to your customers? I mean, I understand that it makes it maybe a little easier, but it seems like it's outside the scope. And it's like, we have this low-hanging fruit. Why aren't we solving that? Let's version the requirements and put the low-hanging fruit in version 1 of the requirements. And then you can put all this crazy stuff in version 2.
So it goes back to the question of do you want us to be able to give you that fix?
No. So Rob, I think what you just said is not true, right? So in one, let's say there's this bug in 101 here, 102. There is no requirement for you to go and implement everything that's in 110 there, right? So you don't have to say, oh, there was this new feature in 110 and I just can't introduce it. The hardware's not there or whatever. Because you can still deviate in anything and say, I don't support this feature. And I don't think there's any schema in which, other than your native schema, where you're going to support all of it. So you already have to deal with this idea that there's parts of the model that aren't supported. So it then just becomes, for this platform, for this software release, this supports 110, but it doesn't support, or 112, 120, I think you said. But it doesn't support this new whiz-bang feature that isn't supported in this train or this hardware.
Yeah, and that's another valid solution. So that solution you're proposing there is to use deviations as part of your versioning strategy. I question whether that's a good solution there.
I think you have to. So there is no vendor today that is shipping a non-standard schema that doesn't have also shipped deviations with them. So I think that like we can create these kind of, oh, I really want to do this thing in isolation if we want to. But I think if we write off something that we write off a solution based on that, it's really a mistake, because we have to look at this wider versioning problem.
But I think that effectively through using deviations, today they're defined as deviations to the API specification. That's what I see deviation is the implementation does not meet the API. Whereas here, you're saying, I want to now, you also use deviations to make changes to the API, bug fixes to the API, not the implementation.
No, two different potential solutions, right? My point was specifically to this case of you wanted to introduce a 120 essentially here. Yeah. And you made the assertion that to introduce a 120, you had to uprev everything. You have to support everything that was in 1.1, but you don't have to support everything that was in 1.1, right? You only have to. The minimum work you need to do is to support anything that was incompatible. That was a incompatible change. But between these two versions, there were no incompatible changes, right? Because they're 1.1 versus 1.2. So, like, I guess I'm just saying it isn't the case that you are doing anything different with deviations than you were doing before, which is I just don't support part of this API.
But you're using the deviations. You're using the deviations to effectively control the versioning of the system, though. So when somebody's looking at that and saying, I want to go, you're saying, when you advertise your module, you say, I support 120. You're not really supporting 120. You're supporting 120 modulo a set of deviations that actually take it back to a different version.
But that was my point, right? Actually, the only way you can work with a Yang schema on a device today is to consider those modulos, because there is no implementation that supports all leaves in another module. So this is the point about is it a bundle of modules that you want to version versus the individual module? Like already we have to deal with that. So for these scenarios where sure that like it's the union of them becomes the version for what's supported, like I don't understand why we can't use that solution when we already have to have it. We should, and thus we should make individual module versioning more complicated.
I would say because I think it makes the whole thing more complicated. I think that if you want to say, well, if you want to effectively say, I want to use deviations to control this, then you end up with I've lost my point now. No, I've lost that completely.
I would say that the complexity of dealing with what's supported in a Yang module today is pretty high, right? You have if feature, you have deviations, you have augmentations. So already we've got a number of ways to be able to wrangle with what's supported. In OpenConfig, we said we don't do if feature, right? We will specifically use separate modules to add new sets of functionality. So we'll extend base modules. Then and then we already have to deal with augment and deviation just because that's the reality of any implementation. I guess what I'm encouraging us to think about is to think about the complexity that the client has already had to deal with because they have that scenario, and more rather than saying, oh look, here's this progression that we can't support with Semver. Say, well, okay, if we had this scenario that we've got this fix we need to make, how can we do that with the tooling that we already have?
Okay, I mean, in terms of deviations, that's not something that you want the vendor implementations to have. In an ideal world, over time, as these things become more standard, you don't want those, do you?
Please support every leap in every module that I publish. It's it would make my life very easy. No, you have to support them, right? Because the reality is that you are never going to be able to split your modules into the set of functionality that an individual implementation supports, right? So if we look at any kind of umbrella module or any module that tries to group, unless you're going to go down to almost a leaf per module, there's going to be some things that will be not supported in an implementation.
It's not the not supported bit that worries me, it's the changing the behavior bit, because deviations can do both.
So Tim Karinioki, and I kind of agree with Rob on this one, is that, with Rob, yeah, the Rob that's speaking, Wilton. So it worked either way, right? So So because the idea is that you're starting at a base in time. It's either going to be 1.0, 1.1, and it's a lot easier, if you're trying to fit back and saying, I'm going to take 1.0, 1.1 and deviate the heck out of it, right? For a fix that's in 1.0.0, that just seems to me to be something that you don't want to do. It's just not, because you're advertising, as you noted, and what got that was that you said you're advertising 1.1.
Yep.
Right, with this amount of deviations, right, versus this change that you're trying to fix. And so I think Rob Wilton has probably got a better approach to this.
Rob, this one. So what happens if you ship a version that has a deviation in it, and the next version of your software provides that function? Do you increment your versioning?
No.
So I don't quite follow how that's consistent with avoiding deviations and requiring patches. I guess it's the patch version for the deviation to eliminate the deviation. Is that it? I'm not following how that's the consistency there.
So I think actually that's not something we've looked at or addressed. I think that goes to the wider versioning issue of versioning packages of modules that Rob raised before. I think that is the point, that you have a version at that level, then you were to remove deviations and things, then you'd start to say, well, that would be a change at that package level. I don't think on an individual module you can do that, because you don't have the binding at different modules. It's just a module full of deviations.
So Rob, just to respond to the kind of many negatives thing, so you can always publish a module that only augments the other version, right? So you can say, okay, there's this, and I'm going to deviate out, and then you can have okay, here's that version plus this augmentation to fix it. So there's a few different solutions around this, and actually, I think it comes down to looking at what you actually see in your code and how you choose to fix the bug. Because sometimes you might fix the bug in a way that's less neat than you would have liked, because you had the perfect leaf name and now you don't want, you can't use it anymore, but just to keep your versioning more consistent.
That's true.
I mean, this is William Luxon from Broadband Forum, but that seems to me to be a decision about how you write the Young modules, and the decision seems to be made that the way that a Young module will be updated is to have a complete replacement that has the changes, and then indeed rely on tooling. For example, there's a pyang output option, the check update from. And I mean, for TR69, we actually used to use a different approach. We used to, because we never wanted to change a published file and we wanted to do new versions, we always used to do essentially augmentation to the data models. But it's more complicated. It complicates the tooling in many ways, I think. And it means that in order to see what you've actually got, you have to look at the output from the tool. Whereas if you're just going to update the module, you can always see what you've got. And so I think, okay, maybe that's not really a technical argument, but I do think that, the underlying thing here is a decision about how Young modules are actually going to be written and published.
Let's just move on before anyone else. So pros and cons of this, my perception. So the benefits of Semver is quite clear, that if you compare two versions of the module, you can determine whether it's backwards compatible, non-backwards compatible, or an editorial change. So that's the pro of Semver. It's widely used, known, it's used by OpenConfig, which is also a benefit in terms of the system. There's disadvantages here in terms of the bug fixing, effectively, what we've been discussing, what it allows and doesn't allow. And as Rob said, there's different solutions you can use to mitigate that. But in terms of what strict Semver allows, it has that issue. And I don't think that issue in terms of Semver is something that's only specific to Yang's usage of it. If you look at the wide documentation on Semver, I think there's lots of other people pointing out this sort of problem, that it works well when you can force people to move to the latest release. You say, I'm not going to support you on the older release, you need to move to the latest. Next slide quickly before anyone asks any questions. So modified Semver, so what we've been suggesting or trying to change this or enhance Semver is effectively to mitigate this issue. That's what the aim is here. So when you look at the head of the development branch, you'd use Semver exactly as before. There's no changes there. You'd use major, minor, patch exactly as before. But what we're allowing is to say that rather than the patch number being restricted to only editorial changes, we also allow the patch number to represent major and minor changes as well. But if you do that, you append either a little m for a minor change or big M for a major change to that patch number, to that string. And effectively, that then tells you that you've broken the continuity of this branch. Rob.
So in this example, what happens when I, in 111M, figure out that I need to make a second backwards incompatible change to the 111 branch?
You go
like,
to...
Does it become M squared or?
No, it goes to 112 big M.
Okay,
so once you poison a branch, effectively, once you've marked with a little m, you keep that little m until it becomes, you put a major change and then it becomes a big M.
But even going between 111M and 112M might be backwards. Is that, how do I know if it's backwards incompatible? Okay, at this point, it's just like, all bets are off, we failed it here, and we just, like, we shipped an emergency release and you're kind of stuck on it, right?
Yes. So in terms of the scheme, the idea here is not to encourage the use of these extra letters. It's not that we're saying, look, this is great, everyone should go and use these everywhere. We're trying to say, this is a way of documenting that you've done this. So it's better to actually, we're saying to the scheme, it's better to actually use this scheme to label that non-backwards compatible change than it is to use a deviation or an augmentation. But you've got choices when you do it. You don't have to do it. I mean, it's not that you have to use this choice.
Joe Clark, we talked about an alternative to this that would add a lot more complexity, but for the arguments that Rob Wilton just said, we said this is something that we don't want to have happen often, and we wanted it as kind of a get out of jail, an emergency, like you said, and we didn't want to layer on additional complexity to try to address what you just said, like how would you know what the compatibility is between 112 and 111 and 112. So we wanted this to be something that could be there, but is not encouraged.
And I'll go on to the next slide in a moment, but one thing, actually no, I can, I'll do it on the next slide. I think it's sort of the same diagram. So the pros, the benefits of the scheme, we think is that it's like Semverse. It has the Semverse stuff at the head of the on the train. So you have all that, that's great. That stuff works as before. It allows those fixes, and actually the scheme allows any arbitrary change in any revision. Effectively, you can do what you like. We wouldn't recommend that. We wouldn't advise you doing that, but it's possible. The numbering scheme has a way of representing that. So it's supported, but not necessarily recommended. The key downsides to it is that it differs from Semver, so there's higher complexity. I don't know if this scheme exists or anything like this scheme. There's loads of different versioning schemes out there, but this isn't the classical Semver that's being used. And from a technical point of view, as soon as you start using those little m's or big M's, you lose the compatibility story. So you can't go from 201 little m to 210. That may be a non-backwards compatible change. Because once you've put those little letters at the end, you're sort of throwing out, you're in no man's land. But still, we perceive that it's better to be able to label those changes than either not to be able to make them or have to make them a different way. Rob.
Hey, Rob Shakir. So what's the guarantees that are made about 220 in this case, right? So you make 111 big M. Like, is 220 mandated to include the change of 111, or like, because this is, there's no consistency in the versioning. Semver has that case that I know that 201 was subsumed by 301, and 40 would definitely subsume 3, but there's no, you always know that if I take tip of head, it's at the latest.
It's at the latest, but between any two major versions, you don't know anything. So you might have deleted every single node between those two. That's a valid Semver change.
Absolutely, but the thing here is it's like there's one train of progress in Semver because you're always going forward to head. Here you have n potential trains of progress.
That's not meant to be the aim here. The aim is to have that one train of progress with side shoots that have fixes to them. And in terms of you saying, is the fix in 111M definitely in 220? You have no idea. It depends temporally when that happened. I would definitely say is if you're putting fixes in older branches, yes, you should put them all the way down the tree. Because that makes
Yeah,
sense.
okay, so you're saying if I'm fixing a leaf in 111M that then got deleted in 20, that's where it might be inconsistent.
Oh, no, I was saying that, say on January the 1st, you produced 220, and then in March, somebody reported this issue. So then that's when you create 11M in March. And so you can't obviously be back in time.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that in that case, I would expect, let's say there's a bug and it's all through all of them. The thing we should encourage is making the change at tip of head and back, and then cherry picking, right? If this is something that we're going to do. So is like your M is, you've lost a bunch of information because you've got a single character now, but you could use something that says this cherry picking. I don't think that this is the right thing to do. I think this is where it's going to get particularly complex. If you end up with that. But I would, if this is something that is progressed, I think there needs to be a bunch of guidance about how to make changes such that there's not incompatible versions with no information as to why they're incompatible.
Absolutely. I definitely, with this, I think it maybe comes up later, we definitely believe that if we go with this sort of scheme, you would have both what this is capable of doing and very strong guidance and recommendations of how you should use it and what you should not use it for. But we still think that this scheme is better to be able to tell the operators, the clients, of what has changed than to pretend they're not happening, than to lie and cheat, which is sort of what happens today, or you do a different approach. Right, next one. So the release of, I don't want to talk about this one for very long. This is effectively an approach. I think that we've dismissed this anyway. So the idea here is that you do Semver per release. So you have a release number at the top, and then you have the major minor patch of Semver. And each time you have a release, it's all right, Chris, don't worry. Each time you have a release, you increase the release number. Fine, great. And within a release, there's normal Semver rules of follow.
So is this a release of a module?
Yes. Move on. Yeah. So the benefits of this, no, we're back on. So the benefits of that effectively is you can do, you can still get the Semver per branching, but obviously the major downside of this, which almost pretty much ruins this, is that you lose the Semver between releases. Any two releases, you have no idea what's changed. So, so I don't think this really has any legs. So, right. Schema comparison tool. So this is the other thing that I actually like. So I'd be interested in feedback on this. The idea here is sort of similar to what Rob's getting at in a way that the version number is a human-friendly identifier to help guide you as to what might have changed. And tooling can use that depending on the rules, but then you have the question about bug fixes being MVC and not and things. That means that the automated process may break with that. So the idea of a schema comparison tool is you have a different way of doing this, and that is that you effectively construct your entire schema, the entire set of modules from release A, and you have another software release, release B, and you construct the entire set of modules for release B. You apply if you want to your deviations to those. You apply if you want to the features that are being used between those two things. And then third, you could even want to subset those down to the subset of the actual modules that you use as an operator. You say, actually, I don't use these features. I don't use this subset of the modules. I'm not interested in these. So you subset it down to those two trees of the stuff that you actually use in both cases with everything applied. And then use automated tooling like PyYang to then say, okay, what's the compatibility on a node-by-node basis of these two trees? And then you can give a summary, a top-level figure that says all the changes in here are backwards compatible, or some non-backwards compatible changes, or whatever. So you effectively compare them side by side using tooling. Now the issue
is this is schema diff then?
Schema diff? Yes. Is there a schema diff tool?
Not yet.
Yeah, but it's. But it is schema diff, and PyYang does this, but there are limitations. So if for the majority of changes, you can determine from the tooling as to what's changed or not. You can determine programmatically saying, this is a backwards compatible change, this is not a backwards compatible change. There are some cases, like if you change a description, if you change a pattern statement, you change an XPath, where either the tooling simply cannot determine that until Rob's companies produce strong AI, or you get to the case where it's very hard to figure it out. It's like you probably could do it, but it's too difficult. And in those cases, there would probably need to be some sort of annotation added into those nodes in the schema to say, either I've made a non-backwards compatible update at this stage, or I've made a backwards compatible update. I don't know which way round is better, whether you do passive safe or active safe, but effectively you would label the schema in that way. Rob, would you like to shoot it down?
Two comments. First is a question, so no shooting.
Yeah.
This is just a way to tell what type of change got made, right? It's not. It doesn't help it doesn't tell me like if I because it's only going to tell you between two particular revisions.
Any two you choose, yes.
And then what do I do about it? Like, how do I who? Is there a version that comes from that, or is it just this is something that tells me it's time to add to the major version?
Yes, it could be. It's more I'm thinking that if you're running some vendor's software at release X and you want to move to release Y, then those vendors would produce instance data, Yang instance documents with the version, with the Yang library information of what's on those devices and also what features are supported, and give that to you and say, look, this is what you, and then you look and say, well, I'm using this of release X. I want to move to release Y. What's the impact going to be? Is this just going to work, or are there going to be things that I need to change?
Okay, so here's the more shooting part. We tried to do something like this and say, oh, we can always just use schema for comparing whether some two releases are going to be compatible with each other, mainly on the telemetry side. And sure, it's an indicator as to how much work you've got to do. But it's not sufficient because you can't know what happened in the description statement. So yes. You can change something like a date and time to have a different epoch, and now or a timestamp to have a different epoch, and this is undetectable in this case. I mean, you can say, oh, maybe the description changed. So really, you end up having to build behavioral testing around this to be able to say, does the leaf still do what it should have done in the previous type? And that's kind of, I think you need to go that far to have this be a robust tool that can replicate what humans can do with a version number.
That might be right.
Okay.
Oh.
Hi, Elliot here. I was listening, I was with you there, Rob, right up until you picked the description example. There's a point at which, in this process, perhaps you have to allow for the fact that the people who are coding these things up are actually not stupid, right? In that, if you're going to change the epoch, right, as an example, that's a good case where you're probably going to use, you're doing damage, right? You're going to have to either use a new node or something like that. So there's a bounding here that maybe you can subvert all these mechanisms somehow, no matter how you slice it, and you should be somewhat circumspect about that.
Rob, to respond, I guess I'm stupid because I think this is actually something that we had a problem with. Basically, I had a type def that described an epoch somewhere, and then we didn't redefine, or we assumed a different one somewhere later. So I think the point I guess I'm trying to make is it's very difficult to be able to rely on this as a way to know whether things are compatible, because as soon as it says, oh, like this shouldn't happen, it doesn't give you enough of an indicator, whereas a version kind of gives you more of an active representation of that.
So I've totally got 12 minutes, so I think it'd be good to try and just go through the last few slides on these different options that we've been comparing. So the pros and cons, we'll go back one more. So the key one, the pros and cons, the key one I think actually is at the bottom that's worth pointing out is that we don't think this is a solution on its own. So I think this is something that would be used above and beyond a module level version number. That's our impression, that this gives you extra information. It doesn't replace that need for a module level version number. And in fact, the labeling of on particular nodes of it being an MVC change or a BC change probably requires a module level semantic version number to be able to do that. So so option 5 is effectively we do nothing. Whatever we got done today is perfect, and some people still think this is the right option. And that effectively says that all changes are backwards compatible. We either introduce new nodes or new nodes and new modules for any MVC changes. You deprecate and then obsolete old nodes. And effectively, I would argue that the history is strictly linear in this case, all updates into the latest revision. you may say introducing new modules is some sort of branching for this as well. A couple of assumptions here is that by deprecated nodes, we're taking a new meaning to mean that they will still be supported, that 7950 says you don't have to implement deprecated nodes, whereas we think that's a mistake, and deprecated nodes should still be supported by a server. It is worth pointing out here that obsolete in Yang allows you to remove any node. And so obsolete effectively, still with these rules, allows you to make non-backwards compatible changes. Yes, Rob?
So just to clarify that, you said deprecated nodes should still be supported.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Implemented, maybe. Still implemented.
So I should accept the data for that node,
Yes.
but I don't have to do anything with it.
No, you should. In terms of implementation, deprecated should mean the same as current.
Oh, okay. It's going away rather than it's gone.
Yes. Yeah. And then the other implicit assumption here in terms of backwards compatibility is that if you introduce a new module, then the old module is going to stick around. That it's not acceptable just to say, I've created this new module, we don't support the old one and everything's fine. That's still going to break existing plans. Next slide, please. So pros and cons, obviously this is already defined, that's good. This gives this full backwards compatibility for clients. So this is, right, I think, right up the client's end of this is great because this makes life easier for them. Disadvantages is I don't think this is sufficient. The design team, I think, broadly doesn't think this is sufficient because I don't think we'd be here if it was. This doesn't allow bug fixes to older releases. Yes, you could use deviations to achieve that. Questions marks as to whether that's a good thing to do. And our perception is, and this is still a bit ambiguous, is we think that using new modules breaks all existing paths. There's a question mark as to what the definition of a path is, whether that includes the module namespace or not. But effectively, I think with this solution that when you choose a new module, you're probably going to impact the clients. That's our thinking on this as to why we think this is a great choice. And the other last one, I think that for me is the thing that we can't rationalize in terms of this solution is that we think the case on the config path where you have two separate leaves writing in different versions, writing to the same underlying system property, we think that has lots of problems. We don't think that that is actually a good thing to allow. It doesn't matter in the state tree, you can have duplication, that's fine, you just get the data twice. But in the config tree, we think that that's difficult.
Balázs Lengyel Eriksson, I want to object to benefit number 2 because obsolete and deprecate means we don't have backwards compatibility.
Okay, fine.
Luberger, I don't understand that last one. Or I don't agree with it. I understand the comment. I don't agree with it.
Yeah. So that might be something that's interesting. So Jürgen also has, or maybe doesn't have an issue. So I've asked him to actually try and describe that.
Yeah, we actually had it. We were talking about, I'm pointing to, no, about when we talked about sysrepo, we talked about how to deal with exactly this case.
Okay, well, it'd be good to see what the solution is and what the constraints of that is.
Sure.
Okay, that's something you can write up. Would be good useful.
So Rob Shakir again, isn't this problem, the problem you described is unavoidable, right? Because we have no system that solely has Yang as the way to interact with it. I mean,
Exactly.
no existing system. So
Exactly.
by default, we have, unless you are using a model that exactly one-to-one corresponds to your CLI or existing configuration, you already have to deal with this idea that there's two input views to one underlying data source.
So I think that's different though. If that's two input views, well, I guess it's OpenConfig and IETF. There's two input views in different schemas. You're saying.
I'm saying that actually native doesn't actually match CLI, right? So it's not like, I can go prod sysdb, let's assume there's something called that. And I can then type something into the CLI, and those two things are writing to the same underlying thing, but with different schema representations, right?
They shouldn't be.
I would phrase it, you always have an internal canonical representation that you may expose in multiple ways. And,
I think it's a question as to whether it's right to expose that canonical internal representation at all.
I think we're going to be forced to.
Maybe. Right, we'll move on to the next slide though, because how long have we got? So a solution comparison table, not meant to be a beauty contest, but this is one we threw together effectively. So this is just summarizing the same things we had before. I don't know if we want to look at this in more detail here now, or you want me to cover the extra stuff. I don't know.
Do any of them cover the backward compatibility requirement?
No, because the backwards compatibility requirement is not something that we're looking at the moment.
Actually, current RFCs do, right?
Oh,
Because you just
yes,
changed the name.
Yes. Well, I don't know. It goes back to the same of having two things right in the same leaf.
Joe Clark, that was one of the things we discussed. If I create a module bar based on foo, because I can't make backwards incompatible changes to foo, and then I just say, you know what, the heck with foo, I'm not supporting it anymore, haven't I essentially done the same thing? I've put the onus on the client.
I did hear you say that when you went through the last presentation, and I don't think that's realistic. I think we all get stuck doing backward compatible things for a period of time.
Yep.
Now, we don't do it indefinitely, but we have a transition period. And whether that transition period is big enough for all our customers is a question, or all users is a question. But, you know, that's like a business.
Sure, I'm just saying that the possibility exists for
I don't know
7950.
of any vendor that has shipped a non-backward compatible type of feature without having a compatibility mode.
Sure, I'm just saying that the possibility exists in 7950. There's nothing that says you
Yeah,
can't
but
do it.
that's an implementation choice
Sure.
as opposed to what the solution dictates.
Yep.
I'll move on since we're... So currently the design team, and this is not everyone's view, is modified Semver is the sort of current front runner. It's not a perfect technical solution. We understand that. We don't think there is a perfect technical solution here. We think it's compromises between different choices. We think it strikes a pragmatic balance between the two. We still think that vendors should decouple versioning of modules, the API, from the software version artifact. So the API implementation, so going back to Chris's point very early on in terms of requirements, we do not think it's a good thing for vendors to be versioning modules as part of releases. That should be separated. And if we go with this sort of approach, that would be one of the recommendations in that document to say, look, you should decouple these two. One's an API, one's implementation. The scheme does allow some things that are undesirable, so it gives you too much freedom potentially, but we still think we therefore need to provide some sensible usage guidelines and constraints on how you should use this, when you should use the extra letter at the end. Try and minimize its usage. It's there as a last resort rather than a first choice. And then there's still an open issue in terms of this approach, is that whether updating the major and minor version number is strict. So some of the discussion has been about whether you're only allowed to upgrade the major version number if you made a non-backwards compatible change, or some people would like to potentially be able to update that per release anyway. So there's a question as to whether that's a good choice or not. And the solution there may be somewhat ambiguous on that. Next slide. So some example guidelines. These were knocked up relatively quickly, so they're not complete. They may not be correct in things. So the guidelines might look at things like churn is painful for clients, try to ship high quality modules, keep them stable. So it's all common sense stuff. Minimize non-backwards compatible updates, particularly in release code. So this is the same. Using the M and the N, little m, little big M as a tool of last resort. Use normal Semver when you can, because that's easier and it maintains this history between the versions. You should version modules independently from releases, as I've said. If a fix is made on an older branch, then port it to all newer branches at the same time. So it's the same thing about, let's cherry pick these fixes and make sure they go everywhere. And also that deprecating nodes is a backwards compatible change. Obsoleting the nodes is a non-backwards compatible change. I think we would change the definition. So this is the example of the stuff that we would also document at the same time. If we were to go forward with this approach, the draft would also have these sort of guidelines in there. Next slide. So some other solutions, quickly covering them. I've got time.
Got a minute.
A minute. Well, okay. So data node lifecycle. You're on the next slide. We're proposing changing status at the moment. Currently, status is defined to be that the server is allowed to implement it or not, and we want to change deprecated to mean that the server must implement it. We want to change obsolete to mean the server must not implement it. And we want to allow a description statement under status to give more information to the clients of those modules to tell you why it's been deprecated or obsoleted, to give you guidance, and maybe give you guidance as to what the replacement and alternative is. And to do this in a backwards compatible way, the intention is to make this requirement if you adopt this versioning, and to have two leaves, global leaves in Yang library that says effectively this leaf is specified. It says the server is going to have these behaviors, or these two different leaves of these behaviors. Next slide. You can stop me anytime. Revision dates, this is a good open question here. When you come to use versioning, effectively revision dates become less useful. If your history isn't strictly chronological, then revision dates are less useful. The question is, do you remove them altogether, or do you keep them but make them less strict? So currently the proposal is that we retain revision dates, we don't break anything, but we don't require it to be chronological anymore. So if you put a fix in an older module, then you can choose a revision date that's just either that doesn't match. We are suggesting that we keep the uniqueness requirement. So you cannot have two different modules with the same revision date. Let's try that. Two different modules, the same name with the same revision date. But effectively, the module name revision date pairing uniquely identifies the module. And the design team is currently leaning towards two. So retain it, but change the rules slightly. Finish. Okay. Yeah. Import by version. So this is something we haven't looked at much detail yet. We need to look at this in a bit more time. Effectively, with these versioning changes, we still have an issue that import by revision we think is too tightly bound today. And if you're using version numbers, semantic version numbers in modules, you'll want to do some sort of import by version number and choose this version or latest or later, or be able to choose some subset.
Christian Hops, yeah, that seems like the top biggest thing in my mind.
Okay.
But it requires a change to Yang, right? Is that why it's hard? Is that why it's not the first thing we talk about?
So no, we're discussing it today. We think you could do it as an extension. So if you do an import and you don't specify a revision date today, it doesn't specify which version of a module you get. So we think we could do an extension to it, to the existing import that says, I'm going to select this. And if you understand it, you get the one you're selecting. If you don't understand it, you get any version anyway.
Okay.
So we think that there's a way around that. Next slide. Client backwards compatibility. Again, we've not explored this properly yet. This is one that's key to several people. We think this is a really hard problem to solve, and an expensive problem to solve. And probably here the solution is that you would have sets of modules like schemas that would marry up with the software releases, and then clients would be able to choose when they connect on a per session basis which set of modules they want to interoperate with. And it'd be up to the server, in this case it was implemented on the server, to do mapping between older versions and the native latest version that's implemented on the server. Sometimes you can't do these mappings. It depends what your change is. It's going to be cases where it's impossible, so we need to be able to handle that. It's worth observing that this can be done in the server, it could be done in a controller, it could be done in a client. And there's questions as to what version would a client get if it didn't do this negotiation, it didn't choose what to get by default. In terms of the design team, there's big questions as to whether vendors would implement this. So I'm still of the opinion it's definitely right to specify this, but there is a question as to whether the vendors will actually spend the money to implement this. And it's because it's a hard, expensive problem. And it's hard, expensive wherever it's implemented, whether it's in the client or the server, but I don't know, being pragmatic. So next steps, so incorporate feedback from the working group. We obviously want, as a design team, we want to conversion a solution. I'm not quite sure whether we're there yet. I think there's still, I'd like to see what you're going to write up on the, Lou's looking at me like, no, don't actually. Yes, I'd like to see that from you, and maybe Jürgen's talking about it, so maybe the two of you can discuss and produce something, because I'd like to see that solution effectively. The hope is to have an initial solution draft ready for 104, but that wouldn't be everything. I think we're aiming to do like maybe a core solution one, which is the module version numbering. We can include the import stuff in there, the status changes in there, and then we'll do a separate extension for like, if we do version selection stuff, I think that's more complicated. That would come as a subsequent draft. We could start working in parallel. But I think that we try and decouple the two. And the schema tree comparison stuff, again, we would deem that as being something we'd add on as a separate extension.
Okay, questions?
I'm Benoit Claes from Cisco. So I've been quiet so far, and I'm wondering what to do at this point in time. So we are a design team with many vendors. I counted 5. So apparently that's an issue. At least for vendors. Now, I would say that not all of us have the luxury to start from scratch with data modeling management. I would like the world to be perfect with models. You know, day one, they're perfect, they're only augmented, and there is no backward compatible changes. I wish to be the idea of producing those models, but and with full coverage, by the way, right? That's something that's required by our customers. It would make the life of our customers way more easier that way. But, you know, it doesn't work that way, at least for the vendors. I wish we had like no train and platform issues. We do. That's a fact. And I wish that we had no requirements from customers telling to us, asking for an update of that specific module on that platform, that train. We do. So if it's not perceived as an IETF issue, right, but a vendor issue who's got like trains and platforms and who's trying to transition into this perfect world of models, standard models, well, maybe what we could do is just pretend this is a native model issue, right? And then we just solve this import revision, and that's it. And then all the vendors, they go together and they document what they should be doing while they transition their native models for the customers who have those problems. And we could document that in whatever way, right? RFC or not. And maybe that's the way out of it.
Rob Shakir, Google. I think that I would like to see some comparison of what you can't do with a multi-module solution, right? Because the aim here is sort of, okay, we're going to go Semver with some modification based on, like, you have to believe that you can't solve this. You don't have to solve the bundle problem, and you can't solve your fixes with augment and deviate.
Okay, so just to clarify, to make sure, you're asking us to evaluate using regular Semver plus deviations?
Well, I'm asking you to consider whether the modifications to Semver are only because you want to do something in an individual Yang file when there's existing language features to be able to mean that you could do it outside of that file.
Okay.
So I kind of wanted to address Benoit's comment. I don't think anybody is not understanding that you have issues as vendors, right, to solve. And I'm not saying that, and I don't think, we're not saying, oh, you definitely can't solve them with an IETF solution either, right? It's not that. It's just that there are ways to solve it without putting it as a one-to-one mapping in a requirement, right? I mean, there are ways to solve the train issue with features and deviations. You know, it's just a question of whether that particular thing should be in the requirements. You know, solving that problem for vendors, should that be a requirement of versioning? When we already have a solution for it, I think that my opinion is requirements should be a lot smaller. Anyway, I just.
Can I ask a question for you? So
you have a problem if you're not forgetting.
So one last question to the room is, for me, is does the room feel like we're going in the right direction here? And they don't have to answer now. If they don't, it would be useful to drop us an email and say, no, I think we're going off the wrong track. Or if you think we are heading in the right direction, that would also be good feedback. So you'll ask for raise of hands on? So, okay, so can you raise your hand, please, if you think we are going in the right direction here, please?
Sorry, may I?
Yeah.
Balázs Lengyel first. I would rather like to hear the question, like, is this the right direction, and is this the proposed modified SAMVER the correct solution to follow, or is that the one question actually, or two separate?
Okay, well, so I guess this asks two questions. Does anyone here think that there's further solutions we should explore before making a decision? Rob, okay? And Chris. So I don't know who the back. Okay.
For me, this is a personal statement, Lou. Until you start hitting the sort of harder requirements, I have no confidence that the direction is going to yield a path that's going to be of use.
Okay.
So it's really hard for me to even have any positive or negative reaction to what's done so far.
Okay.
Because it's just way too early for me.
Okay, so we have lots of feedback and input into which direction the design team should go. I guess that means that we carry on the way we think is the right, and then we have a more concrete proposal at the next IETF.
I'll speak for myself as one chair, and so this is with chair hat on, but my other chairs may disagree. I think you do continue on and come back, give us updates, but don't forget about the hard problems. I think if you say, I mean, you don't want to start with the hard problems. I think the notion of decomposing the problem and hit the easy ones first and make sure you have a solution from there. But then you have to test them against the hard ones because they may not hold together once you hit the hard one. I mean, they have to throw, there might be some simple solution to a hard problem that's just wrong, and you won't know it until you test it.
Okay.
I don't know if the floor wants to respond or my co-chairs want to respond.
That works for me.
Okay.
Charles Eckel. So it seemed to me like we were pretty much just between is SEMVER or this modified SEMVER the right way forward. I didn't hear anyone really going towards those other things. So it seemed to me like there was pretty broad agreement on at least the SEMVER part, and then it's just this bit of, hey, do we really need to modify SEMVER, or is there a better alternative? So to me, it felt like we're gelling around a pretty close, pretty tight area of solution. We just need to really nail that one thing. So that's why I was going to raise my hand, saying I think we're pretty much in agreement.
It sounds like the tight group working on it, a tight group of vendors working on it, are converging on a problem, on a solution that they agree with that doesn't cover the full requirement set. So I don't think we can, and so I've heard some people who responded pretty strongly that they're not happy with the direction, and I also heard that we haven't covered the requirements yet. So I think we're. I take this as this is. I think what we can agree on is that we all appreciate the work being done by the design team and think it's useful for them to continue on the direction that they're going. That doesn't mean that there's consensus or agreement that the solution is the right solution.
Okay.
That's sort of what I got from the room, and that's my read.
I thought, Rob and Chris, maybe I misunderstood, but I thought you were both thinking SEMVER would work pretty well, and then, but the thought that Rob was saying and Joe was that that's not quite, that still causes us some grief. We need this modified SEMVER, and I thought those were the two things we were kind of bouncing between. But if that's not the case, then maybe I misunderstood.
The working group, the design team is headed down a particular path. That's the path they're headed down right now.
I think the question is actually worth asking again on the list. I don't think we are going to have to ponder the answer for a while. But I think there has been abundant feedback. Clearly, there's a number of points where there should be next steps that we can take by consulting the minutes, but we still have hard problems to actually address first, too, before we decide that everything is hunky-dory and we should proceed down this road.
I think we're all in agreement that the design team should continue proceeding the way they're going.
Okay.
And start bringing in some of the other requirements. You know, you heard Chris talk about what he thinks is the major one. You've heard me say what my major one is. I think Rob has talked a little bit about alternative approaches. And I'm not saying that it's independent alternative. I'm saying the total solution.
Yeah, I think, sorry, Rob Shakir, Lou, I think that's well characterized. I don't think, I'm very happy if Simmer is the solution here because I've already done it for a while and probably we're not going to change. But what I do think the wider solution that I think needs to be considered is how this problem space entirely works. So I think we can look at a small set of the problems and kind of say, okay, this is the case, but then we have to look at like overall, not only just the requirements that we have, but what the reality of running a system is before we can really conclude if this is the right direction. So that's the raising my hand for, I think you should look at other things. I think it's take a step back and look at, consider more than one module on a server, because
So
that's
like-
where we have to.
So you mean like packages, for example, or full sets of modules, releases of modules?
Sure. I mean, we can point back to this draft that we wrote whenever it was.
Yes. So we're at plus 10 minutes, which is probably, we're not going to get any further down the road, I think, this evening. So I think we should probably call it at that point. There definitely is work to take to the list.
But we should thank you for staying beyond the last minute of the IETF. It does end early this time, but we still appreciate you staying here and having some really good discussion, and look forward to seeing you all in Prague.
6 minutes left on my battery, so this is timely.